Good afternoon. The title of the panel session is Art Criticism in Eastern Europe. And we will have two presentations. The first one will be by Dr. Maja Fowkes and Dr. Reuben Fowkes, who are founders of the Translocal Institute for Contemporary Art, which is an independent research platform focusing on the art history of Central Europe and contemporary ecological practices. They also head the Post-Socialist Art Centre at the Institute of Advanced Studies at University College London. They are both members of the UK IECA section. So Maja and Reuben, in their paper, will address the topic of art criticism as a reaction to populist tendencies in cultural politics by examining the response of critics both to the spread of populist ideology in the cultural sphere and to art projects dealing with the rise of political populism in Eastern Europe. Please welcome Maja and Reuben.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Okay. Democracy on the defensive. East European art criticism in the era of illiberal globalisation.
Now, this is a very long title, so we had another go and cut it to the base. We will also be talking about art critic under populism.
No matter whether we chose to collaborate actively or merely engaged in wishful thinking or just tacitly tagged along, the party persevered in their quest for power and eventually captured it unconditionally and absolutely.
Before we realized what was happening, the world around us changed, not only in its material aspects, but also in its intellectual complexion.
People who previously had not been taken seriously by anyone, all sorts of charlatans who abound in the cultural world, suddenly gained key positions in various official functions and public positions.
People with integrity became speechless.
Almost overnight, it was possible to utter the most outrageous nonsense and spread lies without anyone raising his or her voice in opposition.
Any distinction between truth and falsehood, genuine values and counterfeit ones, seems suddenly to have vanished.
How was this possible? How could this have happened? What made this possible?
One might assume that these statements refer to the polarized political and cultural atmosphere of the post-truth era of fake news and alternative facts since the rise of populist and neo-nationalist governments in Europe, the Americas, and other countries around the world.
In fact, they come from a text by Czech art critic Jindřich Chaloupecký, written privately in response to the Stalinist takeover of Czechoslovakia in 1948, and dealing with the effect on intellectuals of this far-reaching social and political transformation. The text captures the moment when socialist realism was imposed on the art systems of the Eastern Bloc, which underwent a radical reorganization with the establishment of monopolistic artist associations, the channeling of art criticism through official art journals, and political supervision of the program of exhibition venues, as well as an insistence on traditional teaching in the academies.
Notably, the structural changes to the institutions of the art world proved longer lasting than the artistic doctrine of socialist realism.
If there are correspondences between the situation of intellectuals under communism and the position of the critic under populism, then what do the recent writings of art critics tell us about the changes currently underway in the countries of Eastern Europe?
The stalling of post-communist transition and the wider process of globalisation at the end of 2000s brought in its wake a new wave of political transformations in Eastern Europe, and Hungary was in the vanguard. It was the country where illiberal democracy was invented. Art critic Edith Andras, writing in 2013 in Art Margin, stated, Already the field of art is being centralized, and comrades who are loyal to the regime and whose ideas are in total compliance with the vision promoted by the government are being placed in chief cultural positions. The advantage of such practices is that an official who is selected to lead an institution is close and loyal to the ruling party, there is then no further need for official censorship, since the process automatically guarantees the proper ideological content.
The specific cases she mentions in her article include the fusion of the Hungarian National Gallery with the Museum of the Fine Arts and the imposition of a new director on the Ludwig Museum Budapest, which was accompanied by 2 weeks of protests and occupations of the museum's staircase. This was a novel situation that galvanized the contemporary art world, with artists, gallerists, members of the non-profit sector, and even collectors joining the demonstration.
And actually on this picture we can see a most respected collector couple from Hungary sitting on the stairs, and actually seems like the protesters have put the red carpet down for them to be more comfortable.
Another institution that Edith András discusses is the Budapest Kunsthalle or Mucsának. And one morning, an email arrived in our inbox requesting help on a speedy translation of the following notice. So, it is with profound grief that we regretfully inform you. It's with profound grief that we regretfully inform you of the death of Mucsának, the Budapest Kunsthalle, which after a period of dignified suffering passed away at the age of 117. The cause of death was neglect and the irresponsible behaviour of the institution that goes by the name of the Hungarian Academy of Arts, MMR. The Mucsának was built in the year of Hungarian millennial celebrations and brought down by the system of national cooperation. Its professional activities were completely liquidated by the MMR. Responsibility for the death of the Mucsának lies with those who inserted the MMR into the constitution and, as an act of faith, transferred to it one of the most important places of Hungarian contemporary art, as well as those who voted for these proposals in Parliament. May the Mucsának rest in peace, united for contemporary art.
The obituary notice was the focus of a performative action to mourn the passing of the Hungarian oldest institutions to newly mega-founded MMR, which is inscribed in the constitution. So the MMR, which is entrusted with protection of the values of national culture, is a parallel institution with a budget bigger than Ministry of Culture, and its members are receiving substantial monthly stipend. As you can see, this section of fine art representatives is a very diverse and also gender-balanced group.
Indicatively, in the list of goals of the organisation on the website can be found the aim of safeguarding the freedom of Hungarian artists and the cleanness of the Hungarian artistic sphere.
Okay, let's move to Poland. In Poland, our art critic Adam Mazur and former editor of Shoe magazine, when discussing at the end of 2018 the threat posed to the art scene by the country's populist government, he was still able to maintain that. When the populists took power in autumn of 2015, contrary to expectations, it did not end with an earthquake. No single art gallery or museum director was removed from office. No rector of an art academy was replaced. No control of arts funding was imposed.
Less than a year later, an article in Hyperallergic drew attention to the mounting list of political interventions in the management of arts institutions in Poland. Most recently, the failure to renew the contract of the director of the Centre for Contemporary Art, Ujazdowski Castle. As the author states, the move mimics tactics used by the ministry to silence other cultural workers and heads of institutions deemed outside the orbit of right-wing ruling party ideology. Other similar cases mentioned in the article include the directors of the National Gallery in Warsaw, the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, and Bunkie Sztuki in Krakow.
In Czech Republic, curator and critic Vít Havranek writes about the crisis of National Gallery in Prague, which is currently without director, following political convulsions and resignations in the Ministry of Culture and accusations of misuse of funds. While in this case he locates the problem in competition between neoliberal elites, by highlighting the lack of autonomy and independence, Havranek points also to the vulnerability of all post-communist art scene to political interference.
He says, on the cultural level, it would be meaningful only if the Prime Minister and all politicians stopped approaching culture manipulatively as the owner of cultural capital, and if they began to respect the division of power, allowing cultural autonomy and independence, one of the historical achievements of Europe.
And just to do the full tour of the Visegrad 4 countries, in Slovakia, discussions are heated about the future of Bratislava Kunsthalle, and a recent article in Eastern Bloc points out that SME, in power since 2012, does not pursue the type of open Kulturkampf that is detectable in Hungary, yet the measures associated with the culture minister, Ljubica Lašáková, evokes a populist political logic which does not put forth a cultural policy, but rather appeals to gestures in which she sees short-term political benefits. The author recounts the uncertainties surrounding the future of Kunsthalle, which lacks administrative independence and is deprived of funding by Ministry of Culture that prioritizes folk art and is at risk of losing its building in the center of Bratislava to a European Union-funded creative arts center.
The primary means of gaining popular assent is without a doubt the use of the power of persuasion.
Not only do they know how to exploit the ambition and greed of those who they need to win over to their side, or how to trap others who they want to get out of their way, but equally they do not shrink from exploiting their indifferences, ineptness, ignorance, or carelessness, and above all, the lack of tactical experience.
No one is more skillful than they are at exploiting the potential of modern organizational techniques, which makes it possible to control everybody expeditiously.
In Hungary, art critic and editor Gergely Nagy gave Spike magazine a succinct summary of the state of arts in Hungary now. So, the 8 years of right-wing nationalist and isolationist government has fundamentally changed the cultural environment. The critical wing of culture is now completely marginalized, and the artists in the scene struggle. Many of them have left the country. The current Hungarian art community in Berlin is as big as it was in the 1920s.
The big institutions are controlled through the appointment of loyal or neutral directors, and Fidesz, the ruling party, is not stupid at all. They know that if they control the channels of funding to ensure it only lands in certain places, then the rest will happen automatically. When you can't find public funding and publicity for your work, and you boycott the state institutions out of disgust, then you will eventually be silenced. Soft censorship is working.
So, what are East European art scenes doing faced with problems such as populism, apart from leaving the country?
One approach has been to make populism the focus not just of conferences, but also exhibitions. Skip the Line, Populism and the Contemporary Promise, organized in 2018 as part of the Warsaw Biennial, which was already mentioned, took the conceptual approach of examining populism as a language rather than a political phenomenon. Interviewed in East Art Mags, the co-curator, Jakub Gawkowski, explained his critical approach as follows. I believe that to recognize populism as a language is a step towards reacting to it. Coming from Central Europe, we often associate populism with Kaczynski or Orban, the right-wing autocrats, right? But if you take a broader picture, you can see that what unites the populists is not being far right, it's the way they talk and divide society. What I find really relevant is whether we can think of good populism, not in a sense of dividing the society or harassing minorities, but harnessing its emotional potential. So this idea that since populism has become, as he says, the lingua franca, there is no excuse but to learn it, does not necessarily mean that its methods should be adopted, but rather that its appeal and influence can no longer be ignored by the art world.
Another critical response to populism within East European art scene has been to deal with it not as a linguistic phenomenon, but as a structural challenge. Populism has also been a factor in forming of grassroots institutions that are articulating a new form of institutional critique. In Czech Republic and in Slovakia, one such initiative is Feminist Art Institution, which is a network and code of practice currently signed by 11 institutions and is started in Transit CZ in 2017. In their code of practice, one can also read that feminist art institutions are steadfastly opposed to all manifestations of intolerance, such as racism, homophobia, or sexism. They formulate their strategies for dealing with such situations should they arise. They also state that the feminist art institution promotes a 50% minimum representation of women in its annual program, whether this involves exhibitions, festivals, conferences, or panel discussions, and at least 50% of all managerial, creative, and other positions of responsibility are occupied by women in a feminist art institution.
The feminist art institution is also very much invested in the question of climate crisis and thinking about how art institutions should respond to ecological breakdown. A joint statement signed by more than 80 cultural and artistic institutions in Prague, an initiative that they initiated, asked the City Council to declare a state of climate emergency and to take the necessary measures to mitigate the effects of global climate change. The connection between populism and climate denial are mirrored here by the common cause between grassroots institutions based on egalitarian and democratic principles and efforts to bring about a radical ecological transformation in the face of climate breakdown.
What is more, art critics sometimes go much further investigating the links between unsustainable socio-economic structures and the art world. And in Czech Republic, one of the most controversial recent art texts was entitled Privatization Artist Peter Pudl and dealt with the country's leading collector and philanthropist, founder of Kunsthalle Prague and benefactor of the National Gallery. And on this picture, which is usually accompanied the text that address the problem, you can see him standing, talking to the art world with his bodyguard very close on.
So in it, critic and theorist Václav Drozd writes, Peter Pudl's businesses have led to environmental devastation, leaving a huge carbon footprint, and to this day we are all paying for it with every electricity bill. How will the North Bohemian lignite burnt in carbon fossil fuel plants become a private museum in the center of Prague? The question is also whether the establishment of private foundations and the trading of works of art does not serve for tax optimization and so-called art washing, a symbolic cleaning of money and bad reputation gained in business.
So the text, which was first published in the spring of 2019, was removed from the website under the threat of lawsuit, but now, just a few days ago, reappeared in a revised version and still precisely describes the genealogy of the business of the former coal baron and the role of carbon wealth in the construction of the new Kunsthalle Praha. On the other hand, in an online magazine Art Territory, which is much more art market aligned, an interview with Peter Pudl describes him as an art activist and an internationalist. And he says really clearly that Pudl describes his work as art activism and extends how important it is to be a part of international process, a conviction he has demonstrated already with the name of the new art space, which is still under reconstruction. Kunsthalle Praha merges the German term Kunsthalle with local name of Czech capital, thereby highlighting the Czech Republic multinational past, with Pudl's desire to look for parallels and collaboration opportunities in everything he does, as well as his unshakable opinion that the world is ruled by synergy and openness.
So there's some kind of a tension here between the image cultivated by the collector and the attitude of the art world and its demand for transparency. So in Hungary, one of the most prominent examples of institutional innovation in the face of populism is the Off Biennale. This is a grassroots biennial organized on the principle of preserving artistic independence by refusing government funding and avoiding all state-run venues, and now it's going into its third edition. One of the collaborators of Off Biennale, Gergely Nagy, concluded his Spike magazine text by pointing to the limits of the artistic and curatorial voluntarism on which such ventures depend. He says, small exhibitions and artist-run spaces, theatres, commercial galleries and organisations are maintaining a critical culture and keeping the city's creative spirit alive. The art community is constantly producing work and building coalitions. Our city is at least temporarily a relatively free zone, but how long can cultural workers follow a strategy of self-exploitation? When will these people appear on the radar of the authorities, and when will the government say, that's all, folks?
So much of the information collected here comes from the East Art Mags, a network of 5 art magazines in Central Eastern European region, which through the internationalism of its platform and editorial decisions could also be seen as belonging to the grassroots institutions' response to populism and is a platform for critical voices from the region.
So to conclude, we could look to the writings of the late Slovenian curator and art critic Igor Zabel, who in a piece for a daily newspaper entitled Greetings from the Provinces, felt the need, already in 2001, to remind his readers of the progressive legacy of the social transformations set in motion by the fall of communism, and warn against what would a decade later become the populist rhetorical ploy of opposing true national culture to malign foreign influences.
In our country, it seems the most frequent response to the question of globalizing processes in culture is to detect a threat to our language, culture, independence, identity, and to feel, therefore, that we have to put in place strong protective mechanisms.
I think it would be more useful, however, if we could also be more conscious of the great possibilities and advantages these processes offer us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next presentation will be by Malgorzata Stepnik, who has a PhD in philosophy and sociology, and currently is an assistant professor at the Maria Curie Sklodowska University in Lublin, and currently a lecturer in aesthetics and sociology of art. And she's also a member of AICA. Her theme, the main aim of her paper, is to analyse and compare the critical statements of Polish politicians accompanying the events of March 1968, and also today's political discourse over art in Poland, widely present in both the traditional and social media and highly polarised along party lines. Please, yep, okay.
First, I'd like to express my gratitude to the organizers of the Congress. It's a great honor to me to be here with you. And I will be talking about Vox Populi, politicians as art critics. James Elkins, in one of his latest articles entitled characteristically, Art Criticism is Too Easy, being a sequel to a pamphlet published as early as in 2003, in which he was asking what happened to art criticism, repeats the argument that it continues to avoid judgment in favor of description, end of quote. Hence, we may state that striving after neutrality is an essential part of the critic's current habitus. It seems completely different, though, in the case of populist politicians who are far from any guardedness or sophistication, who willingly assume the role of tribunit plebis, tribunes of the people, fighting with any manifestations of elitism and finally imposing their own aesthetic program. How willing they are to distribute the mindset-altering pills. I'm alluding here to 2 literary works which are important not only within the Polish culture, being parabolic visions of a more universal character. The first one is Insatiability, Nienasycenie, a novel by Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, a pen name Witkacy, an outstanding artist, philosopher, and a trickster of his times, who committed suicide upon hearing that the Soviet army invaded Poland on 17th September 1939. In this prophetic novel, a Sino-Mongolian army takes over the rule of Poland, and the happiness pills prepared by a Mongolian philosopher Murtybing allow the citizens to get rid of the feeling of existential anxiety, philosophical insatiability, and natural objections of being subject to the new authoritarian rule. let me notice that the motive of happiness pills can be firmly associated with the picture by the Wachowski sisters, Matrice, which was inspired by the groundbreaking Jean Baudrillard's oeuvre Simulacre et Simulation. The second of these literary works is Czesław Miłosz's The Captive Mind, a collection of essays first published by the Literary Institute in Paris in 1953. In this parabolic narrative, the writer, a literature Nobel Prize winner, reflects on the state of mentality in people's democracies, a mentality subject to the overpowering influence of Leninism-Stalinism, which, as emphasized by the writer himself, has little in common with the original system put forward by Karl Marx. First and foremost, Miłosz analyzes the attitude of his colleagues, once sophisticated men of letters and critics, but also of artists who became outstanding figures of the new faith, disseminating the only right doctrine of social realism. As Miłosz writes, social realism in the field of literature meant breaking off with what has in every age been the writer's essential task, to look at the world from his own independent viewpoint, to tell the truth as he sees it. End of quote. Therefore, there was a turn against formalism, against all art for art's sake, everything that was private and intimate. In this way, the individual changed into serving the public. Subtle highbrows and artists guarding self-censorship from then on transformed into, to quote Comrade Stalin's words, which were later used by Andrei Zhdanov, the engineers of human souls. Of course, it was possible to adopt different strategies, giving up on taking Murti-Bing pills. One could, for example, withdraw from the public life completely and starve. Or try to outsmart the raging censorship by creating elusive works directed at two various audiences, actually. As ambiguous as a versus Cancerini phase, which when read backwards gains the opposite sense. In my opinion, the most outstanding examples of such works within the field of the Polish painting are Fugues by Wojciech Fangor and Two Young Married Women by Andrzej Wróblewski. On the basis of the works produced by these two exquisite artists, it's possible to discern something which makes one think of both Manuel Castell's concept of inverting the terms of oppressive discourse, expounded by him in The Power of Identity of 1997, as well as Slavoj Žižek's notion of subversion through identification, described by him in The Plague of Fantasies, which was published the very same year. Sometimes it suffices to refer to the classics, which only presumably appears neutral. The most significant case is the stage adaptation of Forefathers' Eve, Dziady, by a great romantic poet Adam Mickiewicz, a work which, by the way, goes far beyond the Polish context due to its immersion in the uncanny, die Unheimlichkeit, which was the subject of Otto Ranks in his study of on the doppelganger. I'm referring to the stage adaptation of Forefathers' Eve in German Totenfeier by Kazimierz Dejmek, the director of the National Theatre in Warsaw, whose premiere in November 1967 coincided with the celebration of the 50th anniversary of October Revolution outbreak. The last official staging of this play in January 1968, whose direct anti-Tsarist threads, as per the director's intention, were interpreted by the contemporary audience as anti-Soviet, caused a wave of students' protest aimed mainly at censorship. Before the play was withdrawn from the general release by the censors, even though paradoxically it was appreciated by the reviewers of the Russian Pravda, Dejmek had attempted at explaining his theatrical piece in a perverse way with an attitude which could have satisfied social realist gustos. As he used to explain, As a materialist, I shifted the Christianism and mysticism of the author from the religious sphere to the realm of folk rituals, emphasizing the revolutionary and patriotic character of the work. End of quote. The stage adaptation of Forefathers' Eve became, to a large extent, a hotbed of protests of the memorable 1968 Polish political crisis, referred to as March 1968 in Poland. Meanwhile, as we know, the counterculture events of Paris May 1968 would commence and bloom in the entire West soon afterwards. Every authoritarian system uses the propaganda of fear and relies on extremely simplified, dichotomous vision of the world and the human being, and it does so regardless of the fact whether it's extremely leftist or rightist. Although similar mechanisms are used, even if not on such a big scale, in contemporary democracies, wherever populists manifesting what is called a besieged fortress syndrome gain popularity. All populist discourses being at the service of a given power are, by their nature, simple and quite a vulgar way. In each of those, there are some functional keywords, as a Polish poet, Zbigniew Herbert, would put it, chains of tautologies, concepts simple like flails, and syntax deprived of beauty of the subjunctive. These keywords, legible slogans, partake in the process of social conditioning of the citizens, which we know from the gloomy dystopias by Aldous Huxley or George Orwell. This conditioning has become particularly easy today in the age of the significant hegemony of social media. An average user of the social media can easily falsely believe in her or his own power. However, an easy access doesn't connote understanding. At this point, allow me to quote Czesław Miłosz again, who says, "Vulgarized knowledge characteristically gives birth to a feeling that everything is understandable and explained." In our part of the world, anti-intellectualism is triumphing again. We could even talk about an anti-intellectual turn. As my friend and an outstanding English painter, Paul Collinson, wrote in one of his essays, we are living in the age of unreason. What is characteristic is the fact that this very phase, the age of unreason, has been recurring for many decades in the titles of scholarly treatises. It should suffice to refer to the work from the field of social psychology by Franz Alexander, about an economic study by Charles Handy, and the book directed at populist nationalism, penned by a British conservative politician, George Osborne, which has been published this year. Clearly, concepts simple as flails, as Abraham Moles would put it, informating social effects, informer des effets sociaux, are also used in the political discourse regarding art. Here I will return to the figure signaled in the title of a politician allegedly responsive to the vox populi, the voice of the people, and I will be referring shortly to the Polish most topical content. Out of respect for my audience, I shall refrain from quoting those very specific statements. I will make only one exception. So I decided to indicate the keywords which have prevailed in the utterances of the ruling party, Law and Justice, over the last few years, which constituted a propaganda triad, namely nihilism, postmodernism, and cosmopolitanism, already mentioned here. The notions generally used at variance with their true meaning while functioning as bugbears. These days, the word nihilism can be heard from the top rostrums in Poland, and it tends to be compared to the worst totalitarianisms in human history. While after all, the nihilistic attitude can result, as it was nicely put by Czesław Miłosz, from an ethical passion, from disappointed love of the world and of humanity. I think that was Nietzsche's. Admittedly, currently this word, which has caught on and can be heard in election speeches, it is rarely encountered in the comments referring to art, while it used to be commonly overused in the reviews and text on cultural politics in the previous political system, namely in the Polish People's Republic. Nihilism, linked with cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitarianism in one phase, was supposed to form a negative antithesis of healthy enthusiasm of the builders of the new reality. While artistic postmodernism, in the perspective of the contemporary tribuni plebis, is a synonym for what is not understandable to them, what is based on an experiment and transgression. Even the local party activists, Lublin-based included, my town based included, holding directorial posts in the cultural institutions, keep censoring the works of contemporary artists, labeling them as postmodern in their utterances, despite the fact that they are unfamiliar with the true meaning of this term. In their perspective, this slogan is just an ultimate insult. Whereas in a more general discourse referring to the substance of social issues, which are inherently ideological, the vision of the corrupted postmodern, which is to say Western culture, is contrasted with the national tradition, just like the philosophical relativism is contrasted with the ethical values, and after all, it's easier to talk about them than to really realize them. It's interesting that at times the intellectuals taking the posts at the other side of social barricades assume a similar tone, claiming that, for instance, this is a quote, postmodernity is about the regime of doubt, which has replaced the regime of truth. However, in my opinion, a regime of doubt is an oxymoronic expression. Anyone who doubts is never totalist indeed. And last but not least, cosmopolitanism. In Polish People's Republic, the accusation of being a cosmopolite was formulated by the official columnists and censors against the writers and artists idolizing the decadent West or rotten West. Today, this word is having its revival indeed. Let me refer to only two, but very significant examples which support this thesis. The first are the protests of the right-wing politicians against the activity, particularly the cosmopolitan character of the exhibition in the Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk. The second one is a fierce critique, of course, again by the right-wing politicians, of the literary works by Olga Tokarczuk, the winner of Man Booker Prize 2018 for her novel Flights in Jennifer Croft's translation. Piotr Gliński, the Minister of Culture and Natural Heritage, once an appreciated scholar, a sociologist exploring, among others, the Green Movement, now a faithful soldier to the leading party, in an interview given at the beginning of August this year, stated, "Yes, it is good that the Pole receives the prestigious award. It would be good, though, if she was a reasonable Polish writer who understood Polish society and Polish community," end of quote. Beautiful, sublime, and on numerous occasions experimental in the form Tokarczuk's books, constellation novels, as she calls them herself, do not fit into the registers of the right-wing gustos. Their constellational character, which is in essence Benjaminian, is an antithesis of stillness, an attitude of static affirmation. For touching upon the threads of multicultural and multi-ethnic history of Poland, the books of Jacob in particular, or for example, ecologism and vegetarianism juxtaposed with the centuries old hunting tradition, especially in Drive Your Plough over the bones of the dead, the writer puts herself in the role of a psychotherapist of the past. Anyway, she is a psychologist, psychotherapist by her education. Tokarczuk can indeed be hailed after Ruth Franklin, who dedicated the July article in The New Yorker to her, a challenger of orthodoxies. I think that the writer's cosmopolitanism, which I personally consider a positive value, bears some resemblance to Julia Kristeva's philosophy, with her tender compassion toward all that is strange, abject or abject, and uncanny, unheimlich, as well as with her belief in psychoanalytic ethics. The power with authoritarian inclinations and partially every power cultivates social pedagogy by reproducing obedient citizens, equipping them with, as Pierre Bourdieu would have said, habitus in a ready-made schemes of thought, perception, appreciation, and action. All pedagogic action, as we read in the pages of his reproduction, is objectively symbolic violence, insofar as it is the imposition of a cultural arbitrary by an arbitrary power, end of quote. This exquisite study, written in cooperation with Jean-Claude Passeron, deals, however, with the symbolic violence which is committed constantly via the language, duplicating and preserving the hierarchy, la distinction, of the privileged and underprivileged classes. This reproduction, according to Bourdieu, is guarded by a homo academicus, a professor of the humanities, or a pious minister of genius, and so on. While it's completely reverse, the social pedagogy cultivated by the populist acts against the complexity of the scholarly discourse, against the sublime of the literary phase, just like any other manifestations of elitism. Homo academicus is in deep water today. The populist power propagates, as I have said before, the language of literalism, in which a simple man can easily move, and first and foremost, with which she or he can identify. In principle, it can be described with the same notions, which have been contrasted by the aforementioned Abraham Moles in his Théorie de l'information et perception, with the concepts belonging to the sphere of aesthetics. So, on one hand, we have an aesthetical, artistic, and literary disorder, and unpredictable, original, informative, novel, and complex work. And on the other hand, there is political discursive order, a language which is predictable, banal, redundant, intelligible, and as simple as possible. The program pauperization of the language is inscribed in the wider context of the contemporary anti-elite turn, or, as Ivan Krastev writes, anti-elite rage, additionally supported by demographic fears in Central and Eastern parts of Europe in particular. Democratic elites are more meritocratic than ever, says Krastev, but they are more hated than ever. Managing mistrust is what democracies are about today. End of quote. This paradox, as the Bulgarian politician scientist points out, results from an equally paradoxical character of the nature of democracy per se, with the self-poisoning nature of open societies, which was, among others, analyzed by a Polish philosopher, Leszek Kołakowski. While, as Tom Nichols indicates in a recently published interesting study entitled characteristically The Death of Expertise of 2017, we live in an age of peculiar worship of ignorance, to paraphrase his words slightly. A problem greater than lack of knowledge is that we are proud of not knowing things, he writes. And even though the statements of the scholar have their origins in the observations of the American society, they remain as universal as possible. As Nichols confesses, I fear we are witnessing the death of the ideal of expertise itself, a Google-fueled, Wikipedia-based, blog-sodden collapse of any division between professionals and laypeople, students and teachers, knowers and wanderers. At this point, it's also worth making a note that ignorance being a cradle of the greatest crimes in the modern history is one of the lessons in a widely read book penned by Yuval Noah Harari. I mean, of course, 21 lessons for the 21st century. And I'm coming to the end, almost. Recently, I participated in a debate on possible methods of feinting against political populism. One of the participants, a young man, stated that we should strive at a more global communication via social media. This statement is symptomatic for the times when communication and its scope is valued more than information or knowledge. And maybe this is me who is a dinosaur in this thinking. I am a critic, a scold, a snob, a paid hack intent on punishing artists and spoiling the fun of the public, a dinosaur, an old man yelling at a cloud. This is what a film critic, Anthony Oliver Scott, with a substantial dose of sarcastic humor, writes in the New York Times. On the internet, everyone is a critic, he continues, a Yelp-fueled takedown artist, an Amazon scholar, a chill reader, empowered by social media to like and share. And indeed, it's hard not to agree with him, for it is the social media so commonly used by populist politicians that produce the thrilling, confusing effect of making the conversation literal. This thrilling effect becomes even stronger every time we realize the great presence of surveillance technologies in shaping our individual preferences, decisions, and actions, namely intelligent digital machines creating contemporary panopticon. For by taking part in mediating our notion of self, they produce a new kind of Die Unheimlichkeit, about which Chris Ravetto-Biagioli writes in her brilliant book, The Digital Uncanny, published this year. With data aggregators, as the scholar notices, we are no longer treated as subjects or addresses, but as sources of information, collected, analyzed, and sorted by algorithms. In this way, a subject or a participant changes into a role, a game persona, an avatar, or a follower. However, remaining in this strictly human sphere of discourse consciously formulated by populist politicians, quite consciously, we can once more repeat after Anthony Oliver Scott, who has been quoted before, the real culture war is between the human intellect and its equally human enemies, sloth, cliché, pretension, and cant, end of quote. So maybe, against all odds, it's worth staying an analog dinosaur. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah? Well, thank you, all three of you, for your provocative and informative presentations. The first thing I would like to say, I just want to make a brief comment, and then I will throw it open to the floor because time is running short. As you all are aware, in zones of conflict, or in periods of suppression or authoritarianism, questions of language always invariably come to the fore. Tom Holland, who's a literary critic working at Oxford, many years ago reminded us that the history of a language is often a story of possession and dispossession, territorial struggle, and the establishment or imposition of a culture, and one could add a worldview. Now, in Maja and Reuben's presentation, they consider that the recognition of populism as a language is perhaps a step towards reacting to it. They also speculate a little bit that perhaps art critics themselves have been unwittingly drawn into reinforcing anti-globalist and conspiracy theory narratives about the post-communist transition. So the effectiveness of the silence of words in that particular case. And Malgorzata, in her paper, she refers to two novels where, where she makes reference to both Manuel Castell's concept of inverting the terms of oppressive discourse and this notion of subversion through identification, which is described by him in the book The Plague of Fantasies. And it reminded me of V.S. Naipaul, who has written about the way that, in his particular case, the Indian population, or many of them, became more English than the English. But that apparent identification with Englishness had a subversive element to it. And I also think about the situation in Northern Ireland, where I'm from, because in the UK there are three devolved governments, one in Wales, one in Scotland, and one in Northern Ireland. The Northern Irish one is suspended at the moment and has been for 2.5 years. And a large issue has contributed to that suspension, and that is that the nationalist population want to see a language act for the Irish language, which was initially suppressed under the colonialist project. But the DUP, who are supportive of the right wing of the Conservative Party and heavily involved in Brexit, are denying the establishment of that language act. Why? Because they feel it will undermine their Britishness, which in the first place undermined the Irish language. So you can see the ramifications of language. And I suppose I just want to turn that into a question. Can clever words, as used by art critics, contribute somehow to the effectiveness and purposefulness of subversion in either of the two zones that you referred to?
Is it a question to
all three of you?
Okay.
Or any one of you?
Okay, I can start. Son? Yes. Okay. I didn't want to start because I will be pessimistic. I think that wise words are always left for wise people. I think that it's our struggles, transgressions, subversions, and so on. They are powerless in the context of the power of stupidity. But every power changes. Every power comes to its ruins sometime, and one thing we have to do is to wait. So perhaps I'm too pessimistic in that respect. Of course, education is significant. We may think, but I'm not sure regarding the example of Martin Heidegger, for instance. So. No, I don't think we can do anything about it.
On the issue of language and responding also to what you said about the curators that we and critics that we mentioned who are dealing with language, and especially the exhibition that we showed that took language as its basis rather than the structures of populism. I think that there seem to be two possible ways of using language in that context. One which is maybe going a bit further, which is trying to somehow appropriate or turn and make some of the ploys of populism useful and subversive in a way, as you said, to find a subversive use for populist language. I mean, this does seem to be a kind of a little bit of a dangerous route to go down. And the other is a way of like trying to be more neutral and just kind of using the language of populism as a starting point, as a kind of structural starting point for an exhibition. And do you want to go?
I think that the question of language is very important, and it's also who is speaking. And the reason why we decide not to speak ourselves is the fact that we have had to, for the same reason that everyone else left Hungary, also moved to London 2 years ago after many years in Hungary. And we decided that the best way is to speak through the or voices from the region who are expressing and vocalizing the struggles which are going on there, and they're all our colleagues or friends or former students, and it's important to give them the voice, really, and and what is good about it that they do still have a voice, so they're not speechless to that.
So I guess the only thing we can do then with these populist politicians who masquerade as art critics is to refuse them membership of IECA, at the very least we could do. Yeah? Okay, I'm going to throw it open now to the floor.
Branekovic, art critic and freelance curator, ICA Slovenia. Well, my first remark would be that it is very easy, not to say cheap, to always evoke political interference into the cultural scene in the former communist or now post-communist countries. While on the other side, the so-called free world is quite far from being free, and the politics or power, if you want, which in the West means money, interferes in the cultural sphere. You have perfect analysis since the 1970s, like Paul Sweezy, not to speak about Noam Chomsky. And my question is, are there monopoles less dangerous than censorship or political interference? By monopoles, I also mean that some people are leading cultural institutions for decades, and they don't change, and they have a very specific orientation or political programs in politics, and sometimes they are not even on their own, but they are some kind of puppets on a string led by someone from outside. Thank you.
Maybe I'll respond and then you can. The first thoughts, why do we always talk about politics? Actually, we didn't. And when Reuben and I started to work in the 90s together and early 2000s, we thought that the ecology is the only problem left in the world after '89. So we thought we were sorted with everything else and we could just focus on what is left to be sorted out in the world. And unfortunately, in the last decade, over this last decade, we have to come back to the political interference. But what is different to the 48 and what is different to the communist time is that we also slightly or subtly addressed is also that these are neoliberal elite very much involved in the questions of institutional workings, such as issues of private benefactors and what is their role and how did that help the privatization, and that possibly, and there are some serious analysis and artworks now dealing with what went wrong with the transition from communism to post-communism, and how did that perhaps lead to the populism we have now. And in that sense, there is need to address the connections, and some of the art critics are doing precisely that, trying to see what went wrong and how did it come to this situation again.
And also, I mean, maybe on the topic of language, I mean, just at the end of your question, to say that a director maybe is a puppet on a string. I mean, for me, that's a little bit of a kind of a populist trope of like invoking that somebody is actually, hiding someone's interest behind. But maybe just to say a little bit more about the, this question of globalization and neoliberal globalization, and how our artists, and how do we negotiate this problem that it seems, from the point of view of the economic effects of globalization, there are so many negative things that people can point to that happened from the 90s onwards across the world, but maybe in this context I was talking about Eastern Europe, and yet how not to swing back completely to the other side and reject all the possible benefits also that could also be seen from those processes in terms of transnational solidarities and all kinds of communication and so on between cultures across the world. And that's why we picked on the quotation from Igor Zabel at the end, which he really highlights that already in the early 2000s of this, the fact that the people shouldn't kind of this sort of knee-jerk reaction against the bad things of neoliberal globalization, just to switch to some kind of very insular, patriotic position. And maybe one other idea that could be useful in thinking about that is to somehow pluralize this notion of globalization. That's why in our original title we have this idea of illiberal globalization. So maybe there are different types of globalization, like neoliberal globalization, illiberal globalization, and even before, if you think of the moment around 89, around those changes, this was a different kind of globalism as well. So maybe we can also introduce the word globalism as a way of thinking about connections between countries on a global level, which are not just based on economics and the domination of one particular system over all other systems.
By the way, you mentioned the division between treating the East and West. I think that it's actually artificial. I agree. Yes, because politics and art and criticism and politics and literature and philosophy, they are always intertwined. It's quite normal, and I don't like Jacques Rancière very much, but one line I really love, but I love one line when he writes that, of course, in his aesthetics and politics, when he writes that a work of art that doesn't have to be, ultimately, doesn't want to be political, engagé, and so on. It has the greatest power, or it may have the greatest political power, in a paradoxical way. And I think that paradoxes, as Oscar Wilde wrote in his famous Dorian Gray portrayal, are what gives us some information about truth. Thank you, and sorry for talking.
Mark, did you want to come in?
Thank you. Marek Wasilewski again. I'd like just to refer to your question about the wise words, because it comes to my mind that the populist revolution was engineered by the words. So I think it's the matter of who owns the more convincing narration at the moment. So instead of being pessimistic and saying that, well, there is no tools for the stupidity and that we have to wait, I think then instead of waiting, we have to come up with a more convincing, a better narration. We need wise words that would win over the words of populists. Thank you.
I totally agree, but just one sentence. I totally agree with you, Marek. We need wise words. We love wise words, and that's why we are here. I think it's obvious, but I think that that it's about what I wanted to say. Really, it's that there is a tension always between being outsider or insider until you speak wise words. Until you are sophisticated just a bit, until you wanted to say something, to communicate something, not to program other people, not to force them to believe what you believe, but to discuss your inside some la différence. You are outsider. When you turn into insider, you may be an artist or a critic or a writer whom people not believe anymore, and that were the cases I was partly describing. But yes, substantially, I absolutely agree. We need wisdom.
Sarah?
This is a little bit more of the same, but I was very interested that when you, as it were, dared to say that you felt powerless in the context of the power of stupidity. But I just wanted to juxtapose two terms. One is, I was going to say in my talk when I got to Willy Munzenberg, I was going to just evoke for everybody Lenin's phrase, useful idiots, or it's ascribed to Lenin, that the whole Comintern operation was aimed at useful idiots, but just to remind everyone that half the useful idiots were the intellectual elite who were writing in Counter magazine or whatever. So one wasn't simply talking about the masses who read AIZ magazine or whatever. So the useful idiot concept, but I was very, very impressed last year when my Polish student, Dorota Monkiewicz, wrote a fabulous thesis about 3 chronological chunks of Polish history and art linked to from 1944 onwards, which was based on her use and engagement with a kind of second generation of very young intellectuals who were just starting having teaching posts, taught by the generation who wrote about capitalism coming to Poland and Coca-Cola signs on the power of culture. But she was using the equivalent of thinking in Polish about the notion of those who were left behind. And her work was extremely poignant. I can't remember the names, of course, of the young anthropologists and the young political theorists and so forth she called, but there's a very interesting kind of non-dialogue, one could say, between the concept of idiots and useful idiots and the actual pathos and tragedy of those who were left behind, and the inarticulateness of those who are driven to violence. So I just wanted to add those two terms.
Anyone else? I think we should stop there because we're running pretty late. Thank you all very much for your attention.